really bad case. There is something to be said when you are a victim of some sort of trauma to be heard, right? And courts don't always hear people.
All right, and welcome back. And today we're here with, we have a special guest with us once again, Mike Day. He's a family law attorney here in the Houston area. And today we're going to be talking about no-fault divorces versus fault divorces, as this is a topic that we get this question all the time from clients. And I think it's just one of those things you really say, does it really matter if you have a fault divorce or not? So today he's going to help us answer some of those questions. We're going to dig into the idea of if there's cheating involved versus not cheating, does that affect the divorce settlement or not? How does that play out? Does it cost anything extra? So we're just all of this complexity. And this is, like I said, this is one of those topics that we just hear all the time from the clients we talk to personally. And then I'm sure Mike has seen this a lot too. So we want to jump over to you. Welcome you in, Mike. I appreciate for you joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Scotty. I always really enjoy doing these videos with you. So thank you very much for having me. Yeah, so let's talk about fault, but let's break it down, because technically you can have a fault-based divorce, right? Mm-hmm. Or the things that kind of give rise to a fault claim, the divorce will still be granted on a no-fault basis, but the bad behavior can still count, which I think is the most important thing that I want people to hear. So, because the distinction is subtle. So with respect to no-fault divorce, for the longest time now, decades, Texas, like virtually every other state in America, has adopted no-fault divorce, which means that you can get a divorce granted on the basis of insupportability, which basically means irreconcilable differences. People just don't get along anymore. But theoretically, you could get a divorce granted on the grounds of adultery, and you could get the divorce granted on the grounds of cruelty or abandonment. Theoretically, you could even have a jury decide those issues. And so it doesn't have to be decided by a judge, because it is extraordinarily rare. It does happen, but it's extraordinarily rare for a judge in a bench proceeding to grant a divorce on the basis of adultery. Roughly 90% of cases settle. And so in the settlement, most of the time, people are agreeing for insupportability or a no-fault divorce, which again, it doesn't mean that the bad behavior doesn't matter. What it means is that the technical grounds for the divorce is no fault. So I tried a case one time where I was representing a person who was kind of unfaithful from the day the marriage started. And that judge granted the divorce on the basis of adultery. And I told my peers about some of that, and it came as a real surprise, because the thinking is that judges really don't care about that sort of thing. Now, where judges do care, and it played kind of a role in the case I tried to the bench, but is if there is financial malfeasance involved with the fault-based ground. So let's break that down. Take adultery, for example. It is one thing for someone to have an affair, which is awful. Don't get me wrong. I'm not in any way condoning that. I'm just saying that if nothing else happened aside from that, a lot of times that's really not going to keep the court's attention. But if someone has spent a lot of money on what the law calls paramours, which are just people romantic, not even romantic, really sexual. It has to be a sexual partner outside the marriage. And that person's buying them gifts, taking them on trips. Now that will get the court's attention, because that gives rise to what's called a waste claim. All right.
Okay.
And so let's say I spend $10,000 taking my girlfriend out to dinner, and we go to Vegas and we gamble together. The court could do a couple of things. They could take that $10,000 of waste into account in dividing the assets, or the court could grant a judgment for $10,000. against the spouse. And a lot of that will depend on the actual structure and composition of the marital estate. So, for example, let's say these folks had a premarital or prenuptial agreement and everything was separate property and there was no community property. Then you may not be able to get a waste claim. But let's say that there was very little by way of a community estate, no prenup, just was very little. And what did exist of the community estate, let's say wages that were earned during the marriage, a lot of it was spent on the paramour. Well, the court in that situation might grant a judgment, because then a judgment, the wronged spouse could seek to collect that judgment any other way a creditor could seek to collect a judgment. So you're probably not going to be able to go after a retirement account, right, if it's separate property. But let's say someone had a separate property beach house, right, not a homestead, second home, a vacation home, or even just a rent house, right? You could be able to theoretically seek to satisfy that judgment like a normal credit card, like if someone didn't pay their credit cards, right, like a normal creditor, and you get the abstract of the judgment, and then you seek to collect on it any number of ways that a judgment can be collected. The other area that I think is really interesting, and I just made a presentation about corporate law and marital property law to the business law section of the State Bar of Texas. But in preparing for that presentation, I reread a very interesting case out of the Austin Court of Appeals, where these folks got married a little later in life. Husband had a significant separate estate. And so the business was his separate property, but it was a construction business. And from time to time, he would put his wages back into the actual entity to capitalize it. Now, he had spent around $700,000 on strip clubs, gambling, and hotel rooms, even though he lived in Travis County. And so it really came back to haunt him, because not only did the court grant a waste claim, but the court also found that he came to court with unclean hands. And this is an important part. So a lot of times you have this notion of a reimbursement claim. And a reimbursement claim is the way that Texas courts kind of balance the equities when someone has a community estate, which is wealth that is by and large created during marriage, or sometimes it can even be the income that separate property produces, right? So if I have a separate property, I own a successful small business, and then that pays profit distributions, that could be community property. So in this situation, this guy got profits from his company, used those profits at gentlemen's clubs and what have you. And so at one point he said, well, look, I use our community monies to benefit the separate estate, or vice versa. I use my business to benefit the community estate. So give me a reimbursement claim. And it was the sort of thing that courts would frequently honor, and would have given his separate estate some meaningful monetary recovery. But in this case, the trial court gave him zero, right? And that teaches an important lesson, because when you are asserting a reimbursement claim and you're trying to come to court, and because these claims are equitable in nature, equitable means the judge can use his or her discretion. She doesn't have to grant it. And the judge wanted to punish this guy. And the Court of Appeals affirmed the judge's punishment of this guy for having as many affairs and gambling and going to gentlemen's clubs. And it was interesting because and this is nothing confidential, right? This is all published in a case opinion, right? But at one point in time, this guy has his buddy who's his accountant testify, and he said, well, we said that the $200,000 plus in gambling losses, that was a business expense. And the court, regardless of the tax treatment, didn't have to honor that determination, because whatever sort of issues this guy may or may not have with the tax authorities, that's between him and the IRS. The divorce court is not bound by that, right? And so that's something that can be considered. Cruelty is another interesting grounds, right? and you can get a disproportionate division. If someone has been physically abusive, right, you can either ask for a cruelty, a fault-based division, or you could sue them for a personal injury, right? And people do that from time to time. And sometimes people think, well, I'll just wait and bring the claim later, which is a huge mistake. Because as a general proposition, if you've been the victim of an assault by your spouse, committed by your spouse, you should either sue the spouse beforehand and get that resolved prior to the divorce being finalized, or you bring that claim as part of your divorce. Does that make sense?
You want to bring any evidence that is part of the divorce up at that time, not try to figure it out later, because later we already settled this matter, right? This matter's already been settled, and we can't come back and resettle this again unless you got something new that's just happened recently again too. So if it's something that was happened during the marriage, you want to bring it up while you're divorcing, not bring it up later and then try to hope to get something later, right? Yeah.
Right. So there's a joke in law school. There's a concept called res judicata, which is Latin for you don't get two bites at the apple.
Oh, okay.
So you get one bite and that's it.
Yeah.
And so you just have to be mindful of that.
Yeah, and that's a lot of good information there, Mike. Going back to some of those things that you mentioned there, like, if you're spending money because you're having an affair and you're spending money on hotels and stuff like that, that makes sense. Like, okay, yeah, you have a reimbursement claim there, and he lost that ability of saying, hey, this is separate property now because he kind of did these naughty things, right? And he had dirty hands, as you said. But what happens if like, and this is a situation because we deal with the real estate part of it a lot. And so we actually have a client that is going through divorce, and it was separate property, right? He owned the home. They moved in together, right? So now it's still separate property, right? They didn't magically that didn't magically change just because they got married, right?
Correct.
But now he has been unfaithful, right? We have a situation where there's infidelity, and that's, in this case, they are claiming infidelity clauses. Does that give her any other? I know we don't know the details in this case, but would that make you say, okay, maybe I can fight for more versus, or does that kind of not change that situation at all?
Well, I think you can get disproportionate division based on adultery.
Okay.
As a practical matter, cases settle 90% of the time, and that might be worth a couple of percentage points. Now, what can really happen is that you can use that infidelity as sort of a proxy for honesty on other issues. Okay. So someone is an SOB in one part of their life, then maybe they're an SOB in another part of their life, right? So I'm mindful of a legendary trial lawyer named Racehorse Haynes says something to the effect of, well, if I can show a jury that someone beat a dog, then I can show that they did anything, right?
Yeah.
And there's something to be said for that, right?
It's your character, right? Like, yeah,
that's right.
So yeah,
but,
so you're
but,
so that.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so you think it's so typically you might just say, well, okay, we have certain assets we're going to be dividing, but because of the infidelity, because of the areas that we've known that you've been, this is what's causing the divorce, maybe we can move a couple extra percentage points on the other side that we normally might not normally divide if it was just, hey, we both just said this ain't working out and you just take yours and I take mine, kind of thing. I'm going to take a little bit more of yours.
Right. But it's bigger than that. For example, let's say there's let's say it's not separate property, right? Let's say it's community property business.
Sure.
Okay. And there's a big dispute about valuation. Well, it's possible that if you're representing someone who is consistently dishonest, right, that the judge or the jury may not believe them in other aspects of the divorce, right? And so you can kind of use that as a method of persuasion that someone shouldn't just be believed, right? Or sometimes, and I've seen this happen too, where people have real estate and someone's like, oh yeah, no, that real estate belongs to my brother, or that's in my mother's name, that belongs to them, even though they used their earnings, right? And you can bring that back into the estate in what's called a reconstituted estate claim. And depending upon the nature of the estate, right, I mean, you're the wrong spouse. You might be able to be made whole in the 401k, right? So you don't have to bring in the husband's brother or mother. But I had a case years ago where I had to do that, right? And it involved, it's too much of a deep dive into nerddom, which Scotty, because you know me, I'm prone to do that. But it really, in that particular situation, invited me to be kind of creative and having all these claims about real estate that you don't have to have writings for, right? Because most of the time when you're dealing with real estate, it's supposed to be reduced to writing. There are some conspicuous exceptions to that, or certainly potential conspicuous exceptions to that. And so it kind of gave me the opportunity to kind of ride on my white horse and really get a much better deal for this woman who had really, quite frankly, been terribly wrong.
Yeah, no, that's good. So like the idea that you can get them a portion they normally might not have gotten because we know there's situations over here, so we can go, okay, well maybe they're being untrue about these other areas, right? And so the settlement, like say, most of these are going to settle anyways and not go to trial. So likely their attorney, if the other side is being represented, the attorney too, they're going to go, hey, they already got you over here, right? So we need to be honest over here, and we need to be more willing to give up over here, because otherwise this could go to trial, right? And then it becomes all public record, and most people don't want that anyways, right? Is that play onto any of this? Like the idea that this infidelity might come out and then be in the public record or being on trial? Does that like deter people from?
Yeah. I mean, as a general proposition, people don't like to air their dirty laundry, right? And you got to be careful in how you do it. But I mean, at the end of the day, if you're having a trial down at the courthouse, that's, barring something really extraordinary happening, that's going to be a public at some level. It may be on Zoom, it may not. But it happens less now, post COVID, but it used to be, you had these retired people that would just go down to the courthouse and watch trials, and it's the best free entertainment you're going to get in town. And
it's like watching the divorce court except in person, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Which it's almost always more exciting on television. Those people would have been better spent. Their time would have been better spent with the Netflix subscription. But they wanted to see the real deal.
You mentioned earlier how you kind of nerd out on some of these things, and that's why we do appreciate working with you, Mike, and that's why we like having you on here, because you are very knowledgeable and you do bring all that past knowledge and case studies, and you're presenting all the time, and you're on the board, the Texas board, and so it's like you have all this knowledge that a lot of other attorneys might not know, and you practice this every day. And we're going to have you on for another video talking about high net worth. So we've been talking about the cheating and how that comes into play, but like, I guess the question would be like, do I need proof of this cheating, or does that matter, or do I need to present it to my attorney, or can I just say
you gotta present it to the attorney. And look, I mean, sometimes people are like, oh, well, we filed for divorce a long time ago, so the adultery shouldn't matter, right? Well, actually, there are cases that say post-filing adultery is sufficient. I mean, that seems, I'll just be diplomatic and say counterintuitive to me, but that is the law. But the other thing, too, is that it's not just adultery, right? I mean, and this kind of gets into the cruelty grounds, right? And so sometimes people will make their partners do things that they're uncomfortable with, or they don't want to do, or they have certain habits, and that can go into cruelty, right? Sometimes there will be a spouse with a substance use issue, and that can go at a minimum into a disproportionate division. If someone's spending a meaningful sum on illegal substances, or the court can consider that in either a waste claim, and can potentially consider that as grounds for fault in the divorce. I mean, there are cases that talk about that, and some of this stuff would surprise you. I'm aware of at least one case where pornography played a role in the court's disposition and in granting divorce on the basis of cruelty. So you would be surprised sometimes what happens. And then sometimes things rise to a level of not just cruelty, but a tort. So one of the seminal cases that went up to the Texas Supreme Court back in the 90s about this wife was a rape survivor. And her husband had a rape fetish, and he would make her do this stuff. And she ended up suing him for a tort in the context of the divorce. And it went all the way up to the Texas Supreme Court, and the Texas Supreme Court said, yes, you can do this. This man's behavior is egregious enough that you can sue him for a tort, right? And so, and then that's interesting because let's say there's not a whole lot there, right? In terms by way of a community estate, and you really want a judgment, right? For whatever reason. And sometimes people just want to be vindicated, right? I mean, that's the thing I always tell people is that, you know, divorce is such an inherently difficult process, even under the best of circumstances, right? So if you have a really bad case, there is something to be said when you are a victim of some sort of trauma to be heard, right? And courts don't always hear people, right? And sometimes your best, you know, and look, and some lawyers kind of prey upon that, right? They'll be like, look, we're going to get them. We're going to take these depositions and we're going to expose all this. But look, if money wasn't spent at the end of the day, you're probably stepping over dollar bills to pick up pennies. And so you really only kind of really prosecute these claims from a litigation standpoint if it's going to get you something. Now, sometimes people don't want that. They just want punishment.
Yeah. So if they're looking for financial, like they might not necessarily get the financial if they're not spending money on, like, say, a boyfriend or girlfriend outside of the marriage, but they might get the idea like, I'm going to punish them. And sometimes I think we talked about before, like using the courts to punish people is probably not a very effective use of your time, energy, or money, because you got to be there too, and you got to prove it, and a lot of things that go into that. It's not just like you just get up there and have your day, right, and have your say in front of court. I think some people think they're going to get up there like Matlock and everything's going to get exposed on one little swoop, and the jury's going to go, right.
I mean, I joke that courtroom-based therapy is one of the least effective forms of therapy, right?
Yeah.
So it's not gonna. It probably won't help people heal.
Yeah. So, but to cap that off, like if we do have proof, we do need to share it with our attorney, and then we can maybe use that as part of we might not use it at all, but we probably need to prove the things that we know. We can't just say, I think they were cheating, or I have an idea, or Susie down the street said they were. It's got to be something that if they were cheating, do we need actual proof for that for the grounds for the divorce? Or in that case, we might go, just irreconcilable differences.
Yeah, I mean, you as a general proposition, you need proof to get a fault-based finding, right?
Okay.
I mean, occasionally, depending upon the situation, the proof could be just your testimony, depending upon what you as the party observed personally. Mm-hmm. But as a general proposition, you want to have some sort of meaningful proof. But before you even embark on that journey, you want to make sure that that's really something you want to do. Because the other thing, especially if there's not a meaningful financial reason to do that, and you have children with the unfaithful spouse, is that it's going to impact your co-parenting dynamic post-divorce. And for sure. A lot of times I tell people that, well, I always say this. I mean, you put your kids first and work backwards from that. I mean, you don't necessarily become a martyr, right? Like, sometimes you have to stand up for yourself. But, if it's one of those Matlock type situations that you alluded to earlier, I always encourage people to really sleep on it, and not just on one night. Like really, really engage in some meaningful reflection about why it is they need that. Because I mean, I go back to Ted Lasso, right? Which I always tell clients to watch Ted Lasso. And, it starts off, a lot of people don't fully appreciate that show is about divorce and recovering from divorce. But, the woman who owns the soccer team, the football club, she acquired it in the divorce to destroy it because she wanted to hurt her ex-husband, right? And it's just probably not the most advisable way to go through life. Especially in that situation, they didn't have kids, but if you have kids, you just need to be mindful of that.
Yeah, I think that's when you involve kids in a divorce, there's always another factor, like you say, like you need to be able to put them first, because they're going to be affected by this too. Because, like I say, they're losing both parents there, and they love both of you, and you will always be their parents, right? No matter what. So even if you're not together, so it's like,
That's right. I have two cardinal rules of thumb. I say put your kids first and work backwards from that, and be nice about everything but the money. You know,
about the
because
money. I like that one.
you can be
Yeah,
nice. I mean, do be nice, right? And
yeah.
especially if you have people who have these bully type tendencies, they're going to try and play these mind games with you. And one of the best ways to respond to that is to just take away that person's power to impact you negatively, emotionally, like that, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
I can't tell you. I mean, I've represented a handful of wives who, especially these stay-at-home wives who, they didn't know much about the finances, and then the husband always took care of it, and then they get a little savvier, right? And then the husband tries to play these games with them, and it's just like, no, they're going to stand up for themselves, and they're not going to fall for the trick of, becoming emotionally dysregulated and disparaging the dad to the children. They're just going to be nice about everything but the money. And that's one of the most effective ways to assert yourself. And if you really feel like you need to get back at someone, to get back at them.
Yeah, no, that's good advice right there. That's probably worth the price of admission right there, people. So you said a couple things there. It made me think about this other topic, and I think I will touch on it at least a little bit. Because you said some of the forms of manipulation, and maybe we've seen gaslighting. And now there's this term going around. I don't know if we should use it or not, and I don't know if you recommend your clients use it or not. But narcissist is becoming more of a common term in today's legal world, and there's books on it, and there's dealing with a narcissist and all this other things. So none of us are psychologists or psychiatrists or whichever, and you have to be able to diagnose this person with this thing. But obviously, every person might have some tendencies or be self-serving at some level, right? Obviously, if we're dealing with someone that has those narcissistic personality types, as part of this, cheating or not, either way. But I think that's something I wanted to touch on and see what your take was on that.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Scotty, and because it illustrates an important principle, which is that sometimes the biggest victories that you can obtain are not at the courthouse, right? Your best day in life is always better than it's generally better than your best day in court. And a lot of judges, they're underwhelmed by the concept of narcissism, right? But it's a very real deal. You go back to the book, The Culture of Narcissism, which you would have thought, oh, yeah, that's part of the zeitgeist. It came out, what, last year? No, it came out in January of 1979, predicting that America was going to suffer from an epidemic of narcissism. And make no mistake, narcissistic abuse is a real thing. It just is one of those things that won't necessarily translate into what you need to get at the courthouse, right? And so, but going back to this idea that people need to be heard, right? And that is an important part of healing. And for some folks who are going through this process, it's too much. But there's a great book called Truth and Repair, and it is about how victims experience the legal system, right? And some of those experiences are not necessarily conducive to healing, right? And so that's why you have to really ask yourself, the narcissistic abuse, the gaslighting, as real as that is and does happen every day, is that going to advance your legal cause? Oftentimes, if your legal cause is going to be advanced, it's not because of the narcissism per se, it's because of something problematic that the narcissism caused, right? For example, spending money at a strip club or gambling or on a much younger mistress, right? Those are things that will get the court's attention. But if their narcissism is manifesting in a way that's not necessarily legally actionable, right? Aside from just you've had enough and you want your divorce, there's no shame in just keeping your head down and focusing on healing, right? Which will not, by and large happen as a result of your interactions with the legal system. It will result from hard work that is done outside of that, whether it's through support groups, a therapist, reflection. Great book that I recommend for certain clients is a book called Fatal Flaws by a man named Stuart Udofsky. Dr. Udofsky was, an unbelievably impressive CV, right? He had been the psychiatry department chair at Columbia and the University of Chicago. He was recruited to the Baylor College of Medicine, and he was responsible for recruiting Menninger from Topeka down to Houston. And he wrote this book. It was published in 2007 or so. And it's sort of an explanation, a case study of various personality disorders. And he's got one chapter on sort of lower functioning narcissism and one chapter on higher functioning narcissism, right? And it's great because he wrote it after he'd been at Baylor for a little while, which of course is in Houston. And so some of it are slices of Houston life, right? So it's anyone who is dealing with that type of element, I would encourage them to read that book as well, because they'll read it and some light bulbs will go off, and those light bulbs will provide insight and validation in a way that might pave the ground to make better decisions when it comes to legal and financial decisions, legal decisions and financial decisions that have to be made in the context of a divorce.
It's a good point you lead on there, that if we're dealing with that type of personality or dealing with those kind of issues, that leaning on your attorney, although in your case, you're very knowledgeable a lot of this stuff, they still need to do a lot of self-healing outside of the courts. That's going to actually help them deal with understanding how to deal with their, because if they have children, that likely will be an ongoing thing, and not just once the divorce happens, it'll keep happening, right? So it's something you need to learn to deal with. And also like having the sense of healing from how you were treated or whatever happened, so that you can move on. And so I think those are really good points there, and good books. So I'll put links in the below so people can go order those books. Well, we got a few more things here that I want to touch on. And one of those things, you kind of touched on some of this, if they are hiding those assets because of they're hiding other stuff, they're hiding infidelity, so they're hiding assets and stuff we might not know about. How do we deal with those, and how does the court deal with those things? Because I know we can get into like private investigation maybe, or hiring somebody, but is that something that's viable or easy or costly, or what's your take on that?
Right. So let's talk about hiding assets. Your first level of inquiry is always going to be the tax return, right? Because the tax return, especially if it's been prepared by a CPA, it will kind of give you the introduction to the composition of the estate. So you'll have K1s that will tell you where your ownership interests are. Okay. Now, you can hide assets in ways that don't necessarily manifest themselves or get reflected in a tax return. Go back to that example about the guy who put real estate in his mother's name and his brother's name, right? And so some of that, like in that situation, the wife knew about it, right? And if the person doesn't know about it, then that becomes more challenging. I mean, the great thing about real estate is that you can do searches that are a matter of public record that tell you who owns what, right? And even you can do Secretary of Search to see if people own an interest in an entity, because you can have things like, let's say someone has a small business, right? And they are using the MasterCard to spend those corporate monies on somebody they shouldn't, right? And it comes out of what the law calls retained earnings, which are earnings in the name of the business, but have not been distributed out. So not a CPA, I don't give tax advice, but normally that's not something you would expect to see on a tax return necessarily. Mm-hmm. And so one of the ways that you look at it is to get the entity's financial information, right? And depending upon how complicated the entity is, right? I mean, sometimes people are in business with family members, right? Or good friends. And then sometimes people, because this goes back to the notion of someone's dishonest in one area of their life, maybe they're dishonest in another. And I've seen cases where the husband or the business owning spouse, it's not always the husband, but frequently it is, but the business owning spouse gets crosswise with their partner, their business partner, because the sorts of things that the dishonesty, the selfishness that they brought into the marriage, they also brought into their professional lives. And so that's always, an interesting inquiry, right? And
An idea like how you do anything is how you do everything, right? Like, it's going around the internet like now. Like, are you putting away your shopping carts? Because if you don't put away your shopping carts, you're bad to other areas, right? Too. It's like, I mean, kind of, it's like, that's very, very little hyperbolic about that, but it's like, okay, maybe, right?
right,
So,
right, yeah. No, it happens. It absolutely happens. And especially if somebody does have these sorts of like narcissistic tendencies, right? Because there's just something about that it's, unless you're just an extraordinarily high functioning narcissist, people are going to catch on to it. And even if you are, I mean, people eventually figure that stuff out.
yeah, everything comes to the light of day eventually, right? Like, you can't hide something forever. Um, well, I appreciate that, Mike. I guess I'll ask you a couple, like, for kind of a closing remarks on this idea of, fault versus no fault. I mean, you've covered a lot there. And obviously, we will link to Mike's information down below where you can contact him if you have any additional questions, or if you are going through divorce, you can obviously seek out Mike's advice here, have a consultation with him, and retain him of attorney to proceed. Any other takeaways, Mike?
But yeah, I mean, I just hope that this presentation, I mean, it's educational in nature. I mean, you don't feel like you have to call me or anything like that. This is just to help people understand things. And in light of that sort of public service announcement, I'll say two things. When people are looking for an attorney, one of the things that you ask people now is how experienced the lawyer is with business valuation issues, because people get hung up on these percentage points, but a lot of times it's not so much the percentage points, but the percentage of what, right? And so one of the things that you're going to want to do is make sure you have an attorney, and it doesn't even have to be business, it can be real estate, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many lawyers don't really understand the real estate valuation issues the way that they should. And then the second thing that I would say, and this will be my last book recommendation, because I am notorious for making book recommendations, but if you're already in a divorce and it's taking on sort of the tone of a high conflict divorce, especially if there are children involved, I would highly recommend people read a book called When Divorce Fails by Arthur Lanoff. It is probably the most insightful book I have read that explains how divorces become high conflict. And with those insights, you can kind of reverse engineer and work your way backwards from how do I avoid that? And spoiler alert, it involves work that is generally not done and cannot be done through the legal system.
No, that's good. And I appreciate you plugging the books like that idea, because I think I tell people all this time, and I didn't get this listen from me, but like someone else really smart, they said like, hey, every book you read has like 5 years of someone's knowledge and experience boiled down into these pages. And so the idea, if you can read that book, you can get all that years of experience without actually having to walk through yourself on those cases. So things you haven't walked through before, you can gather information. And even if you can take away a few of those nuggets out of each of those books, then you can go. And if you just apply some of those things you actually learn, which is funny, you mentioned books, a lot of books. Me and Amber, this is a kind of a foreshadowing that me and Amber are actually writing a book here in the future. So we will be releasing a book here, and our book will be more about through divorce, but also like healing post-divorce, because that's who we're really targeting the book towards, is people that have been through the divorce. So healing and how maybe do it right again the next time, because you might not be in that space yet, but eventually you're probably, a lot of people end up remarrying. Me and Amber actually, previously both divorced. And so we are married now. And one of the things that we decided was like, hey, our faith was going to be a big part of our marriage going forward, because we needed something to lay that foundation on. That'll be our story. We're almost done with it. It'll be out soon. And maybe I'll put the link to below it as well once it is out.
You and Amber are very wise people, and I really can't wait to read that book. That's going to be
appreciate that. But yeah, we'll get you a copy. So if you are in Houston, me and Mike are here, but we are here in the Houston area, all three of us. And so if you are going through a divorce and you are seeking advice, or You could schedule a call with us below as well too, and we will obviously help get you connected to the people you need to be connected to, like Mike. Our specialties has to deal with the real estate and the housing aspect of the mortgage side of it. But I appreciate you being with us today, Mike. As always, we're here to bring you real life experience to all your real estate needs, and we'll check out the next video with Mike coming up.